Why do university students think they have the right to shout down speakers they don't like? Well, because their university professors tell them so. That's my subject on today's Fiamengo File. I'm Janice Fiamengo of the University of Ottawa. Most of us know what to expect when it comes to the guardians of political correctness on university campuses. Whether it's Sandra Korn in the Harvard Crimson newspaper a couple of years ago who argued that academic freedom should be replaced by what she called academic justice, or more recently the students of Wellesley College who alleged that, quote, shutting down rhetoric that undermines the existence and rights of others is not a violation of free speech, end quote. These students are enthusiastic about the suppression of so-called hate speech. Most of them can't provide a definition of what that is, but given that even the Supreme Court of Canada has had trouble doing so, it's not that surprising that undergraduate students struggle to explain coherently what they're so keen to outlaw. But when the same type of anti-free speech drivel comes from university professors, then the illogicality, incoherence, and lack of historical accuracy are shameful. Today I want to take a look at an anti-free speech open statement issued by something called the President's Advisory Committee on Building an Inclusive Community at McMaster University. This is a large group of faculty, students, and staff at McMaster, which is in Hamilton, Ontario, who decided to issue a statement opposing Professor Jordan Peterson's scheduled talk at McMaster in March of 2017. In their public statement, the advisory committee said it looked forward to, quote, public critical opposition to Peterson's ideas, end quote, and declared in their final sentence that Peterson's talk was, quote, not an exercise of freedom, but instead poses a threat to us all, end quote. That statement explicitly encourages students and others that in shouting down Professor Peterson, they are defending against a serious threat to society. So how do we get to this point that university professors believe they have a moral duty to encourage disruptive protest? I would invite you all to take a look at the website of McMaster University's President's Advisory Committee on Building an Inclusive Community, or PACBIC for short. Their mandate, as they explain it, is to, quote, identify and anticipate issues affecting, quote, equity-seeking communities, and to advise the President on these issues and on inclusive policies. Fair enough. The committee writes annual reports that are posted on its site, and if you're interested in a kind of one-stop shopping hub that aggregates all the social justice projects of the modern university, you'll find much of interest on the PACBIC site. This group issued its open statement on March 16, 2017, just a day prior to the scheduled St. Patrick's Day talk by Professor Jordan Peterson on the subject of freedom of speech and political correctness. And as many of you know, the event was planned as a panel discussion, but all the invited speakers except Peterson backed out as a result of the controversy that it generated, and the talk was ultimately shut down by social justice goons who engaged in their usual thuggish tactics of loud chanting, noise-making, and physical intimidation, all in a good cause, of course. The President's Advisory Committee began their statement by saying how, quote, deeply troubled the group is that a man of Professor Peterson's, quote, notoriety, as they call it, was invited to McMaster University in the first place. They characterize his invitation as an opportunity for him to once again articulate his, quote, callous disregard, end quote, for the, quote, personhood of trans and gender nonconforming people. And this is the first of many misrepresentations of Professor Peterson's carefully articulated platform, which anyone who has listened knows has nothing whatsoever to do with disregarding anybody's personhood. There are many outrageous statements made by this group, including the boast that the advisory committee members understand the science of gender better than Professor Peterson. That's right. They have the chutzpah to accuse him of having, quote, limited knowledge and being, quote, entirely unaware of new developments in various disciplines related to sex difference, where supposedly the male-female binary has been, quote, long debunked. That's pretty rich, coming from a group of activists amongst whom I could find precious few, if any, actual scientists. The past chair of the committee, Dr. Jane Aronson, was a professor of social work, not exactly a hard science or even a particularly intellectual discipline. And the current chair, Emile Joseph, is also a professor of social work. But their assertions on this point, ludicrous as they are, in my opinion, are not my main focus. What most intrigues me about the Advisory Committee's statement is the section in which they argue that Jordan Peterson's public speech shouldn't fall under the category of protected speech. This is what they say. But freedom of speech doesn't now and hasn't ever meant that we can or should be able to say whatever we like in public spaces regardless of the impact of our speech on others. That's okay. They go on. Instead, the concept of freedom of speech has most often been mobilized to protect specifically counter-hegemonic ideas that actually challenge rather than reiterate the status quo. End quote. So this is now a fairly standard position taken by those who believe that only their words deserve protection from being shouted down by goons and hooligans. PACBIC essentially claims that free speech does not and was never meant to include hate or even non-hateful speech that happens to support injustice in some way. This is an incredibly broad net that they're spreading. And this line of argument culminates in their claim that, quote, freedom of speech was not conceived as a means to protect normative ideas from contestation by marginalized communities, but to protect those whose speech might actually contest normative or nationalist ideals from censure, punishment, and retaliation by state forces, end quote. First of all, it's worth saying that this is ridiculous. Nobody is protecting, quote, normative ideas from contestation by marginalized communities. The so-called marginalized are perfectly free to contest Professor Peterson's views all they want and to hold their own talks and forums. And presumably that's what PACBIC does every time it meets to discuss LGBTQ issues. But never mind that. I want to pause over what they say about free speech because it is actually extraordinary, and because I've heard versions of this fairly frequently lately, though never so far with a citation to tell me exactly who didn't conceive of free speech protections extending to normative ideas. Who is this authority that they're referring to? Yes, Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School cultural Marxist, said something along these lines in his 1965 essay, Repressive Tolerance, a must-read, by the way, for anyone who wants to understand the SJW particular tone deafness on free speech. It's a short essay, an easy read, and one that's breathtaking in its assumption that only righteous revolutionaries get to decide what kind of speech can be heard. For Marcuse, tolerance was not a virtue if it meant tolerating injustice, and therefore tolerance shouldn't be extended towards any public words that uphold a repressive status quo. Marcuse was also a man who stated quite openly in the same essay that violence on the part of the have-nots, as he called them, against the haves, wasn't really violence, or at least not the sort one need worry about too much. He's hardly a proponent of what any reasonable person could call a free and democratic society. So where does the idea come from that in Western democracies we have any sort of tradition of protecting only so-called counter-hegemonic ideas? I challenge the President's Advisory Committee to name its source because this is a profoundly anti-democratic statement. And it's one that leads without much of a stretch to exactly what we saw at McMaster University when Professor Peterson spoke there. Certainly, their idea is not found in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, in which all Canadians, not just those with non-normative ideas, are guaranteed freedom of thought, belief, opinion, and expression, and freedom of peaceful assembly. Yes, Canada has very problematic hate speech laws, in my opinion, but these are to be applied after the fact, not before someone has even had a chance to speak. And what about the great architects of British liberty who created the intellectual climate that made our charter possible? They certainly didn't define free speech in anything like the terms of the advisory committee's McThinkers. John Stuart Mill in On Liberty in 1869 spoke of the fundamental necessity of being able to defend an idea from objections to it. Obviously impossible if one can't even express the idea in a public forum without being shouted down. We could go even further back historically to John Milton and his Areopagitica of 1644, in which the search for truth is paramount and in which wrong ideas cannot defile the righteous mind. In fact, they're even necessary to the strengthening of that mind. Milton would have found the advisory committee's formulation very strange indeed. The fact is that no thinking person can seriously claim that the worth of an idea is dependent on whether it is, quote, normative or not. This is a ridiculous, vacuous, and smug formulation by a group of people falsely claiming to be leaders in progressive thought. And it's sad that such a group associated with a university, and in fact with power to influence university policy, could express such ill-conceived arguments and could have the gall to think they count as wisdom. But let's imagine, just for a few minutes, that there is some kind of validity to this idea that marginalized peoples and their statements are more worthy of protection than normative ones. In what sense could the advisory committee members see themselves as expressing non-normative ideas, given that they're part of an official university-sanctioned body advising the president of the university on the issues they have decided are important? The subjects these professors and students study and teach on critical race theory and disability studies and intersectional feminism, well, these have been validated by the university for decades. Nobody aggressively protests their ideas. None of them legitimately fears for their reputations or livelihoods because they speak out for trans rights or queer sexualities or anti-colonial resistance. They're not criticized or shouted down or censored for any of their revolutionary discourse. On the contrary, they're celebrated for it. They win awards for it. They're given research grants. They're invited to serve on committees, and some of them collect very large paychecks for teaching the convoluted half-logic and constipated verbiage on display in their mixed statement. It's Jordan Peterson who has received the official statements of censure at his university for his supposedly normative ideas. If he's so normative, how come not a single one of his hundreds of colleagues at his university would stand with him in his criticism of dictates about gender-neutral pronouns? Professor Peterson received 2 threatening letters from his employer, the University of Toronto, telling him that if he didn't submit to the speech rules made by people like the PACBIC members, he would face serious consequences up to and including having his classes canceled. Not exactly the treatment one associates with people expressing normative ideas. And not surprisingly, not a single academic with a declared commitment to inclusion and diversity and dialogue said a word in support of Professor Peterson. I suspect that what really rots the advisory committee's socks is that Jordan Peterson is the voice of bold, galvanizing heterodoxy, and the advisory committee members are the Borg-like conformists, marching in lockstep and trying to force everybody else to march too. The committee ends their statement by acknowledging that proponents of free speech may paint opposition to Jordan Peterson as an indicator that free speech is under threat. Well, yes, they will, because when you can't express your views without being shouted down by a hyped-up mob, that clearly is free speech violation. It's Alice in Wonderland time for the elite thinkers at McMaster University who believe that simply by saying that Jordan Peterson, quote, reduces the humanity of trans people, they've actually proved that he does. Only one thing is clear. In telling their adherents that Professor Peterson, quote, poses a threat to us all, the advisory committee sends the message that stopping him is morally right, even necessary, perhaps. They're not telling the truth about that, and they're not telling the truth about the Western tradition of free speech, and their shameful dishonesty is there online for all to see.
Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please support us on Patreon. If even half of our subscribers gave us $1 per month, we'd be well on our way to creating more and better content. And don't forget to subscribe to us on Studio Brule.